The morning at the university library began as usual. Soft light from the lamps, long rows of bookshelves filled with knowledge, and the faint rustling of pages turned by students preparing for exams. Among them was Tasha, a young black student with bright, determined eyes and a confident posture. It was her first year at the university, and she was eager to prove to herself and others that she belonged there. Tasha slowly walked along the shelves, scanning the spines of books. She was looking for a rare volume her professor had recommended for a term paper. After searching the section thoroughly, she realized the book wasn't there. Letting out a small sigh, she glanced over at the librarian's desk. Behind it sat Mrs. Grayson, an older white woman with stern eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mrs. Grayson had her hair neatly pulled back and her sharp gaze fixed on the computer screen in front of her. She was known for her strictness, but her manner often left students feeling uneasy. Tasha hesitated for a moment, then gathered her courage and approached the desk. Her voice was soft but carried a tone of polite confidence. "Good morning. Excuse me, I'm looking for a book, but I haven't been able to find it on the shelves. Could you help me, please?" Mrs. Grayson looked up. Her icy blue eyes scanned Tasha, lingering briefly on her warm-toned skin, and something faint but unmistakably dismissive flickered across her face. Her expression grew colder as she responded. "Everything's organized by the numbers," she said curtly, her eyes already returning to the screen. "Just read the labels on the shelves." Tasha hesitated, momentarily thrown by the tone, but she didn't back down. She knew she had done nothing wrong and was simply asking for assistance. She tried again, choosing her words carefully. "I've already checked, but I couldn't find it. Maybe it's in the storage area or reserved by someone else. Could you check, please?" Mrs. Grayson sighed loudly, as if Tasha's request was an unbearable burden. She reluctantly began typing on her keyboard, her irritation clear in every motion. When she finally spoke again, her words dripped with condescension. "If you can't figure it out on your own, maybe you shouldn't be here in the first place. It's all pretty straightforward." Tasha felt a flush of heat rise to her face. She knew these words weren't just rude. They carried something more, something subtle but deeply cutting. Taking a steadying breath, she replied calmly, "Excuse me, but a library is a place where students should be able to ask for help. I'm only asking for clarification." Her tone remained respectful, yet firm. But instead of softening, Mrs. Grayson's demeanor grew even more hostile. Without a word, she grabbed a book from the desk and threw it down in front of Tasha with a loud thud, the sound reverberating through the quiet library. The book nearly slid off the desk and onto the floor. "Here, take this if you're so desperate," Mrs. Grayson snapped, her voice laced with irritation. For a moment, the library fell silent. A few students nearby glanced over, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease, but no one intervened. Tasha stared at the book, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet Mrs. Grayson's. Her chest felt tight with frustration and hurt, but she remained composed. "No one deserves to be treated this way," she said quietly, yet her voice was steady. Mrs. Grayson smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "Complain all you want," she said dismissively. "Do you really think anyone will care about something so small?" Tasha didn't respond. Her gaze grew resolute, and an unmistakable determination burned in her eyes. She took the book, turned on her heel, and walked out of the library. Behind her, Mrs. Grayson sat back in her chair, seemingly satisfied with her victory in the small encounter. But Tasha knew in her heart that this incident could not be ignored. Tasha walked out of the library, clutching the book tightly in her hands. The cool air outside felt sharp against her flushed cheeks. She stopped under a large oak tree in the university courtyard, trying to collect herself. Her thoughts churned, replaying the librarian's cutting remarks and the cold, dismissive way she had been treated. It wasn't just the words, it was the look in Mrs. Grayson's eyes, the way she had made Tasha feel like she didn't belong. Tasha turned to glance back at the grand library building with its tall windows and stately columns. To her, it had always seemed like a symbol of knowledge and equality, a place where anyone could come to learn. But now, it felt distant and unwelcoming, as cold as Mrs. Grayson's gaze. Inside her, two opposing forces wrestled for control. One urged her to let it go, to brush off the incident and move on. The other refused to accept what had happened. If she stayed silent, how would anything ever change? Tasha closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice. Never let anyone make you feel like you're less than them. You've earned your place, and you deserve to be treated with respect. These words, a guiding light in difficult moments, gave her strength. This isn't just about me, Tasha thought. If she treats me this way, who else is she doing this to? Someone has to say something. A couple of hours later, after her lecture, Tasha made her way to the university president's office. Dr. James Williams, her father, was not just the leader of the institution, but a symbol of fairness and equality. His open-door policy was known throughout the campus. He believed that every student deserved to be heard, regardless of their background or status. Today, however, Tasha didn't come as his daughter. She came as a student who had experienced an injustice. Dr. Williams sat at his large wooden desk, his sharp eyes scanning a stack of papers. When Tasha entered, he greeted her with a warm smile that quickly faded when he noticed the serious expression on her face. "Is something wrong?" he asked, standing and motioning for her to take a seat. Tasha sat down, silent for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. Then, in a steady voice, she began recounting what had happened in the library. Her tone was measured, but every word carried the weight of her emotions. She described how Mrs. Grayson had ignored her request for help, dismissed her, and ultimately thrown the book in her direction with an air of disdain. Dr. Williams listened intently, his expression growing graver with each passing detail. When Tasha finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "Are you sure you want me to get involved?" he asked gently. "Yes," Tasha replied firmly. "This isn't just about me. If she can treat me this way, she could treat others the same, or worse. No one should have to deal with this." Dr. Williams studied her face for a moment, then nodded. A flicker of pride crossed his features. "All right," he said. "Let's make sure this is addressed." Later that day, Dr. Williams walked into the library. His tall figure and purposeful stride immediately drew attention. Students, familiar with the university president's reputation for fairness, watched with quiet curiosity as he approached the front desk where Mrs. Grayson sat. The librarian looked up, and her demeanor shifted. Her face brightened with a forced smile, and she quickly adjusted her posture, giving the appearance of professionalism. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "What can I do for you today?" "Good afternoon, Mrs. Grayson," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred this morning." Her expression faltered for a split second before she composed herself again. "Of course," she said, her tone still polite, but tinged with unease. "What's this about?" Dr. Williams paused briefly, his gaze steady. "It concerns a young black student who asked for your assistance," he said. "She reported being treated in a way that was unprofessional and disrespectful." Mrs. Grayson stiffened, her forced smile faltering. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly masked it with a defensive expression. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said hurriedly. "I deal with so many students every day. Sometimes they can be a bit demanding." Dr. Williams didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fixed her with a steady gaze, giving her no room to evade accountability. "Let's ensure there's no misunderstanding," he said. At that moment, the library door opened, and Tasha stepped inside. She walked up to her father's side with calm confidence, her gaze meeting Mrs. Grayson's. The librarian's face went pale as realization dawned. The student she had treated so dismissively wasn't just anyone. She was the president's daughter. "It was you," Mrs. Grayson blurted out, her voice betraying her shock. "Yes," Tasha replied evenly, her voice steady. "I'm here to confirm exactly what happened." Mrs. Grayson stared at her, momentarily at a loss for words. For the first time, she began to understand the gravity of her actions. Mrs. Grayson froze, her body tense as the president's calm but firm tone filled the library. She realized this was no casual conversation, though she tried to maintain her composure. A flicker of unease crossed her face. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. "Of course, I always try to assist students," she finally replied, forcing a thin smile. "But sometimes their behavior, well, it can be less than respectful." Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining neutral, but his tone growing sharper. "Respect is something we all owe each other, regardless of who stands before us," he said steadily. Let's clarify. I'm speaking about a young black student who came to you for assistance this morning. She reported that you not only refused to help her, but treated her in a manner that was dismissive and entirely unprofessional. At the mention of black student, Mrs. Grayson's face noticeably stiffened. For a brief moment, her smile faltered. Then she quickly replaced it with an air of deflection, attempting to downplay the situation. I don't recall anything like that, she said hastily. I see so many students every day. I can't possibly remember every interaction. Just then, the library door swung open, and Tasha stepped inside. Her posture was poised, her gaze steady, and her steps deliberate as she approached her father's side. When her eyes met Mrs. Grayson's, there was no fear, only calm resolve. "Come here, Tasha," Dr. Williams said, his voice softening as he addressed his daughter. Mrs. Grayson's mouth parted slightly in shock. Her pale face turned a shade lighter as she realized the young woman she had treated so harshly was not just a student. She was the president's daughter. "It was you," she stammered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop herself. "Yes," Tasha replied evenly, her voice firm but calm. "And I'm here to confirm everything that happened." Mrs. Grayson began to stammer, her words rushed and defensive. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to encourage independence." Tasha didn't let her finish. Her voice was clear and steady as she spoke, her gaze never wavering. Encouraging independence doesn't involve throwing a book at someone or refusing to help them when they ask. You made it very clear, through your actions and words, that you didn't think I deserved your assistance. Mrs. Grayson flinched slightly at the accusation, but she tried once more to justify her actions. "Students can be demanding," she said, her voice weaker now. "I only wanted her to—" Dr. Williams raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His gaze was unyielding, and his voice carried a weight that silenced the librarian instantly. "Mrs. Grayson, this is not about a student being demanding. It's about how you chose to respond. Your behavior not only reflects poorly on you, but also undermines the values this university stands for. As an employee of this institution, your role is to guide and support students, not belittle or dismiss them." Mrs. Grayson's face flushed with embarrassment as the gravity of her actions settled in. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Williams glanced at his daughter. Tasha stood tall, her composure unwavering, as she observed the woman who had treated her with such disdain, now struggling to find her footing. "This matter is far from resolved," Dr. Williams continued, his voice steady but firm. "We will be conducting a formal investigation into this incident and reviewing your conduct as an employee. For now, you are suspended from your duties until further notice." Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened. Her attempt to respond dissolved into a murmur of protests, but Dr. Williams had already turned away, his focus shifting to Tasha. "You handled this with dignity," he said to his daughter, his voice now carrying a tone of pride. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Tasha nodded slightly, feeling the weight of her father's words. She had stood her ground, and though the experience was draining, she knew it had been the right thing to do. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else would face the same treatment in the future. Mrs. Grayson sat stiffly behind her desk, as though rooted in place. Every word from Dr. Williams felt like a verdict, heavy and final. She tried to think of a way to justify herself, but deep down, she knew that no excuse could undo the damage. Around her, the library was silent, with students discreetly watching the scene unfold, waiting to see how it would end. Dr. Williams stood firm, his expression resolute. He turned slightly toward his daughter, whose calm presence reinforced his own. "Mrs. Grayson," he began, his tone even but unwavering, "as president of this university, it is my responsibility to ensure that every student here is treated with respect and dignity. Your actions today are a direct violation of both professional and ethical standards. This institution cannot and will not tolerate such behavior." The librarian's facade of confidence crumbled further. Her voice grew desperate, trembling as she spoke. "Please, sir, this was a misunderstanding," she pleaded. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just frustrated. It won't happen again, I promise." For the first time, Tasha interrupted, her voice steady but firm. "Frustration isn't an excuse for what you did," she said, her gaze meeting Mrs. Grayson's unflinchingly. "And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's experienced this. I just happened to speak up." Mrs. Grayson tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. She realized Tasha's accusation wasn't baseless. This wasn't just about one moment. It was about a pattern of behavior she could no longer defend. Dr. Williams sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, his tone carrying finality, "I value your years of service to this university. However, your actions have shown a disregard for the values we uphold. Therefore, I am suspending you from your position while a formal investigation is conducted." Her face turned pale, her hands gripping the desk as if to steady herself. She opened her mouth to respond, but seeing the unyielding determination in Dr. Williams's eyes, she knew it was futile. After the conversation concluded, Dr. Williams gestured to Tasha to join him as he walked out of the library. The air outside felt lighter, as though the weight of the situation had lifted. They paused near the entrance, and Dr. Williams turned to his daughter. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Never stay silent when someone tries to diminish your worth or dignity. You deserve respect, just like every student here." Tasha smiled faintly, a sense of relief washing over her. The sting of the morning's humiliation had begun to fade, replaced by the quiet confidence that justice was being served. She knew she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for others who might have felt powerless to speak up. In the following days, news of the incident spread across campus. Students from all backgrounds, black and white alike, praised Tasha for her courage. For many, the story wasn't just about an altercation in the library. It was a powerful reminder that silence allows injustice to continue, and standing up can create change. For Tasha, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a lesson. She realized that every voice matters, and that even in the face of adversity, it's essential to fight for fairness. Now, as she walked back into the library, she felt different, stronger, more assured, and proud of the stand she had taken.